what I described. He said it was around 8-10 feet tall. It had long arms. It screamed at him and then started running after him. And he noticed the same thing I noticed. It ran on 2 legs, down to 4 legs, to 2 legs, to 4 legs. And he said he had to run a long ways back, back to get to his car. He turned around before he got to his car, and it was gone. So, it gave him a good chase and a good scare anyway.
Right. And what's interesting about these two accounts that you really don't often encounter, that is the bipedal to quadrupedal locomotion. That makes sense. That is the way a gray ape would move. And it's funny, a lot of times the people get a sense that they're being chased or they see something coming down hills at them, but you don't often, at least in my experience, and I've researched hundreds of these cases, to hear this kind of story where they move from bipedally to on all fours. And I find that fascinating. And actually, it makes a lot of sense. If you have these extended arms, if you're somewhere, biologically between a humanoid and a great ape, this would be the type of locomotion you would employ, especially in rough terrain. So I find that really fascinating.
Well, I think that also gives them the speed, too. I mean, from the standpoint, I think the thing could have probably caught us if it wanted it to. Like I said, I think what saved us, it was the two of us, being more than just one person. But, that's what kind of scares me, too. People who go out looking for Bigfoot by themselves. I had a guest on my show, Rob, that really scared me. He goes out and he does look for Bigfoot, but he doesn't carry any type of weapon other than a small knife. And, I said, what are you going to do if you actually do encounter a Bigfoot? Is that knife going to help you? Let alone, probably a gun isn't going to help you probably either. But I mean, and these people go out there and they don't have any GPS type of system, like a cell phone isn't going to do you any good out in the middle of a forest or out, wherever. You need some type of locator too, that to protect yourself in case you get hurt or break a leg, if you don't end up dead. And that scares me. A lot of these people that call on my show or some of the guests that go out looking for Bigfoot, they're not prepared.
A lot of people aren't. I found that in a lot of the research I've done interviewing people that have either had spontaneous encounters with these creatures or went out with the express purpose of finding an anomalous creature or a ghost, because we cover all sorts of paranormal things. We've really expanded beyond just cryptozoology. And I find a lot of people are doing it as rank amateurs. They are, first off, if you're dealing, say, with a Sasquatch-type creature, if you're not an outdoorsman, if you are not familiar with the lay of the land, like you say, if you do not have a GPS system and the kind of protection you need and the kind of protection you need against the environment, be it to keep warm and stay safe, you're just going out for the lark, then you're putting yourself in great physical danger regardless of whether or not you run into a Sasquatch. And I find that in a more paranormal sense, I get the same vibe from a lot of people that go solo into like a haunted house. And it's like, you have to understand the potential of what you might be dealing with. And if you're just going in as a joke, you could open yourself up to, in both a paranormal sense and a very literal physical sense, all sorts of dangers that you just won't see coming, because this just seems like a fun time. And it's bad enough if you go in unprepared as a group, but if you go in unprepared solo, then you're just begging for trouble.
Oh yeah, I mean seriously, it could be anything from a ghost, a poltergeist, or falling through a floor and dying because nobody knows you're in that building and you can't get out.
You're right. So many, allegedly haunted places are decrepit. They have a lot of history and often aren't kept up well, especially if they've been abandoned for a while. And we've all been. And I'm a big guy, so I have to be very cautious around rotting floorboards and whatnot. And my foot has gone through more than one. So I understand that completely. You need some friends nearby. You don't want to be trapped in these things. Again, it's physical dangers that come from the environment, and it's possible paranormal dangers that if you're not prepared to deal with either, you could get in a lot of trouble from both.
Oh, yeah. I'll tell you another real quick story. I mentioned it last night when I was talking to James. back around early 2000s again, I was managing, I told you, a chain of camera stores. But the building I was in, our main store was built in the 1870s in Tacoma on Pacific Avenue. It's old. It was so old that it was originally like a 12 or 13 story, and they cut off about 6 stories of it in the mid 60s because it was not safe. I was really into like taking like ghost town pictures and eerie type pictures. And upstairs, it used to be originally a hotel brothel, in the 1890s all the way up to the 20s. It was a brothel. Instead of really being a hotel, it was right off of where the ships would come in, the sailors would come in. Anyway, right. I was up on like the third floor. And, I was taking pictures because the old brick walls from the hotel were there, but they were bricked up. But it was really interesting. And, the walls were all tore out where each room was. But, I mean, the marks are still on the wall. The weird tile flooring was there for each room. And
beautiful stuff.
Beautiful. I was taking pictures. And all of a sudden, I heard this crunch. And I dropped to my armpits.
Oh.
Now, what was down below me was our sales floor. It had a vaulted ceiling, 3 stories.
Oh my!
From the hotel days. So I, the only thing that saved me is that there was a group of customers and the employees saw me hanging my legs and my butt hanging through the ceiling. And I tell you, that was the scariest experience I have. And that's why I was mentioning even last night, be careful if you're out there ghost hunting or looking for anything, because you could run into something just like that. You could fall through the floor. Now, another little quick story. James on last night. He was out, back maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, out in the woods. I can't remember where, because he heard about, what do you call it, occults and things like that. He ran into a cult, witches, and they were getting ready to sacrifice a lamb or a goat or something. He said they had chained up on a pole, and they were going around the fire. He said like 12, 13 of them. And he said when he ran into him, he was so scared. And he said he was so lucky he got out with his life because, he could have had his heart removed or been barbecued, if they would have found him.
Sure. I mean, that's frightening. Running into a scene like that, it feels like you're stepping out of reality and, right into a drive-in horror film. I can't even imagine the kind of overwhelming fear that would overcome you coming into a situation like this. One of the recent podcasts we did, speaking of witches, actually one that's going to come out this week, dealt with this account we got from Venezuela, where a man named Juan had seduced a young lady, promised to marry her. They were from a small town in the Andes right near the Colombian border, and it was, of course, a very Catholic town. And he pledged his love, he pledged to marry her, but, of course, did not make good after they consummated. So she was left
Well, how many men do that to women anyway?
It's horrible. It's horrible, but it's horrible even more so in this cultural context because she was like a very pious young lady who, was just worked frequently with the church, and now because she came from a very small town in very, very deeply Catholic Venezuela, she was now, damaged goods. Like the other men would not consider marrying her anymore. Basically, what we were told is that if this happens to you in this culture, you can give up any hope on marriage or a family. You basically either turn to prostitution or witchcraft to make a living at this point, which is horrible. And you could talk a lot about the dangerous side of the patriarchy in societies like this, or how it's an unfair balance for what men can do as opposed to women. But in this case, this woman was basically just hung out to dry, and she learned witchcraft. And the account goes that she started tormenting everyone. It was like a multi-generational home. It was the Mendoza family. So Juan lived there with his mother and his sisters and their children. So it was 3 generations. And this woman would turn into this bird-like creature that looked like a gnarly vulture from the neck down, but from the face up, it was this woman's face, but like covered in filth, and dirt itself is sort of like they say cleanliness is next to godliness. When you actually have the dirt on your face, that's a sign of immorality and conceding to dark forces. So it was, and she'd have these red glowing eyes. So you basically have this bird walking around the tiles of the roof of your house, and this course had this sort of colonial style courtyard in the middle of the house, like so many do in that neck of the woods. And so every night the family would look up and see this fat, scummy vulture with like molting feathers and talons, not only on the feet but on the wings, with a human head and glowing red eyes, and it would follow them wherever they went. Sometimes she would float in front of the house in these like tattered rags. They went to the church for help, and at first the priest was almost not willing to help, saying that he deserved what he got for what he did to the young woman. But then, realizing that there was kids living in the house and a lot of innocent people, he told them to put holy water on the beams that held up the roof and to hang this blessed rosary on the door. So at that point, the witch could no longer land on the roof and could no longer touch the front door. She used to slam into the front door with all her force. But that didn't stop her from basically following them every time they left the house at night, everyone in the family, and still tormenting them. So they eventually had to go to what they called the ultimate anti-witch, which is a very big mouthful, I'm quoting directly, but basically it was a more powerful black witch that was known for throwing curses on other less powerful witches. So they actually stopped going to the church and went to like an even darker form of black magic to fight her. And she took one of the talons that had been stuck in the door from when the original, scorned woman had slammed into the door. One of her talons got wedged in there. And this super witch, for lack of a better term, put a reverse hex. And so every time this family would be tormented by this bird creature, she would fall into a heap on the ground because of this apparently very powerful spell, and just end up being this naked woman running around in front of their house trying to fly, which is sad and terrifying and weird. But it's funny because, like I say, it was a terrifying ordeal for this family, and it was really interesting to report on it. But when you step out of, we're all used to a very typical day-to-day life. Most of us don't have to deal with these things, and even if we see something like your astonishing Sasquatch encounter, it doesn't happen most days of our lives. So to slip from like the surly bonds of reality as we know it, and to have this phenomenal thing happen, be it your friends stumbling across this coven making a sacrifice in the woods, or this family that is suddenly besieged out of the blue by a half-bird, half-demonic-faced woman, it is mind-blowing and terrifying. And I think part of the appeal for me is I lived in L.A. for a while. I did a lot of writing. I did a lot of screenplay doctoring. There's something utterly cinematic about it that I also find very fascinating.
Well, we all want to believe in these stories, too. And, let's face it, I really think some of the stories out there are real. Now, they might have been embellished through the years, but I do think there are creatures, or has been creatures, or how can I say it, maybe even from inbreeding or whatever, that it caused some of these stories originally to start.
Oh, 100%. I think there's kernels of truth in a lot of the most fantastic things. And it's interesting. Like you say, I really break it down. We have 13 categories on cryptopia.us. And there's hairy hominids and avian anomalies and aquatic enigmas. And basically what I do is I try to break things down. That's the reporter in me talking, into like bite-sized chunks. Try to correlate them to the category they best fit in. And what I find is that besides these 13 categories that I've designated for these creatures, they basically fall into three camps. They're either cryptozoological, extraterrestrial in the sense that they don't seem to be coming from Earth, whether, again, it's another dimension, another planet, it's hard telling, but just not of Earth, and paranormal. Those are the main three breakdowns. And I've always been most interested in the cryptozoological, I think because I have a fairly grounded, logical mind. I'm a skeptic in the classic sense in that I want to look at the evidence for what it is and assess it as objectively as I can. Not in the sense that so many use it where it just means I'm going to debunk everything that isn't a part of mainstream science regardless. That to me isn't skepticism. That's just being a debunker. That, if that's your way, that's fine, but I have a big beef with a lot of people like that. I'm skeptical in the sense that I want something to have at least some compelling eyewitness evidence, and